Hello and welcome to the 14,937,612,003rd episode of this particular program. Today, my chief counsel, Roy Cohn, and I will be discussing Senator Joseph McCarthy's infamous 1950 speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, and asking the question, how is it that one junior senator from Wisconsin could launch his political career on lies? Now, the contents of the speech, the Wheeling speech, as it's called, are interesting, but I think we ought to start by discussing some information about the background of the speech, beginning with the man himself, Joseph McCarthy, because he really does occupy a fascinating place in the history of this country. So beginning with Joseph McCarthy, the image that Senator McCarthy broadcast for himself was it was ultimately multifaceted. But firstly, he was an upstart, which is there's a good deal of truth to that image. He was born in 1908 to immigrant farmers. His father was an Irish immigrant, his mother a German immigrant, and as you may have surmised, he was not born into fantastic wealth, unlike my chief counsel Roy Cohn. At age 14, he dropped out of middle school to assist his parents on the family poultry farm, only resuming his schooling several years later after a nasty winter killed his entire flock. He graduated from high school in 1 year at age 20. While some individual facts in this biographical summary may be contested, some say, for example, they was not 14 when dropped out of school, but 16. The general image of a poor family navigating difficult times is generally agreed upon and accurate. This is important because McCarthy was not always the most truthful with his record. But in 1930, McCarthy enrolled in Marquette University, where he gained a reputation as a card shark, or someone who cheats at cards, and a heavyweight boxer and boxing coach. These were the ways that McCarthy financed his law degree, which he graduated with in 1935. He was admitted to the bar in that same year, 1935, and he began working at a private law firm. He launched a campaign for district attorney in 1936 as a Democrat, but he failed to gather adequate support. He lost. He then began looking for a nonpartisan position, which is kind of ironic given his future circumstances, but he began a campaign for circuit judge against a 20-year incumbent. Now, this incumbent was justifiably very confident. He had a wealth of experience, 20 years, he's a 20-year incumbent, and Joe McCarthy is next to none. He works at a private law firm. He just graduated from law school. And this is really where Joseph McCarthy's life as a political entity begins. If you look at his campaign for DA, which he lost, to the extent of our knowledge, there was very little dishonesty or perfidious marketing. But his campaign for circuit judge launched a very effective smear campaign against his opponent. He claimed that his opponent was several years older than he was in reality and earning a greater salary. And this worked for him. He, in 1937, became the youngest circuit judge in Wisconsin's history, which is quite an achievement. He was a controversial judge, but not nearly as controversial as he would later become as a senator. He was mostly controversial because he moved through the cases, the list of cases that his predecessor had set up, which was there were a lot of cases, and he moved through them very quickly, which some perceived as him being unscrupulous. But the state Supreme Court generally upheld his rulings. This was 1937. Keep in mind, just 5 years later, the U.S. entered World War II, and McCarthy, being a circuit judge, was exempt from military conscription. But he saw a great political opportunity in military service, and he joined the Marines with the express aim of advancing his political career, which won't be him afforded. In the Marines, McCarthy was an intelligence officer. As an intelligence officer stationed in the Pacific, he spent the war debriefing pilots after they returned from bombing raids over Japan. He was never involved in combat, so there was virtually no danger for him. Nevertheless, he greatly inflated his combat record, which he claimed that he fired more bullets than any Marine in history during his 14, a figure he later changed to 17, and then 32 engagements with the enemy. He forged a letter from his commander to obtain a citation for a phony combat wound, and he asked to receive, and was indeed awarded, the Distinguished Flying Cross. He even coined his own nickname, Tail Gunner Joe. It's important to keep in mind that nothing I just said actually happened. This was all fabricated. After Joe left the Marines, he resumed his position as a circuit judge, but he wasn't content in this position, and capitalizing on his falsified war record, McCarthy narrowly defeated the incumbent Senator Robert La Follette in 1946 Republican senatorial primary and assailed his Democratic opponent, Howard McMurray, as a man so desperate for election they would accept communist support. His senatorial campaign was, as you could probably guess, rife with deceit and mendacious advertising. His career in the Senate was initially unremarkable, if not slightly pathetic. He was a popular guest speaker, but he wasn't well liked by other senators or by the media. He was known to make anti-Semitic statements, and in early 1950, the Senate press corps voted McCarthy the worst U.S. senator currently in office, and he began to fear that he could not be reelected without a major issue to improve his political standing. And then, for a celebration of Abraham Lincoln's birthday in February 1915, I said 1915, but I meant 1950, he's invited to speak to a group of Republican women in the sleepy West Virginia town of Wheeling, where he delivered an historically inflammatory speech. he claimed unambiguously that he was in possession of a list of 205 names that were known to the Secretary of State. This is a quote. 205 names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party who were nevertheless still working and shaping policy in the State Department. So these are big charges. As far as the Wheeling speech goes, McCarthy's motivation isn't really a question. The Wheeling speech instantly launched McCarthy into stardom. This was big news. Card-carrying communists in the State Department, he alleged. So why would he do this? Why would he lie? Well, the Saturday Evening Post, an example, had heralded his arrival with an article entitled "The Senate's Remarkable Upstart," and he searched for 3 years to find something to prove that he was in fact remarkable, and this was his issue. He targeted the issue of communists in the federal government. That next Saturday, 2 days after delivering the speech that he delivered on a Thursday, McCarthy sends a letter to President Truman urging him to investigate communism in the State Department. But he claims to the President of the United States 2 days after the Wheeling speech that there are 57 known names. So we go from 205 to 57 in a matter of 2 days. We know from close associates of McCarthy, specifically his secretary, that he was delighted by this new wave of publicity that he received. Following intense media exposure, McCarthy capitalized on the public American fear of communism and continued to make speeches and public comments criticizing the Democratic administration for their inadequate security measures for the investigation of communist infiltration in the American government. Keep in mind that he had previously launched a district attorney campaign as a Democrat, so this gives you a sense of how McCarthy viewed partisanship as more of a tool than an actual alignment. He turned the threat of Soviet espionage into a partisan issue, really, and in response, the Tidings Committee was called to investigate these claims. Since McCarthy had made these accusations against the Democratic administration and a Senate led by a Democratic majority, the hearings of the Tidings Committee, which was a partisan committee, quickly devolved into an investigation into McCarthy and his credibility instead of communist infiltration. The Tidings Committee, which was led by Maryland Senator Millard Tidings, was a direct attack on McCarthy. In fact, the term McCarthyism was coined during these hearings. One witness, Owen Lattimore, later published a book entitled Ordeal by Slander, in which he defines McCarthyism as, quote, insisting constantly, emotionally, and menacingly that the man who thinks independently thinks dangerously and for an evil, disloyal purpose, unquote. Now, I think the most interesting part of the Wheeling speech is it was absolutely successful in the short term. The political climate in 1950 was such that the fear and vulnerability of the American people could be exploited by anyone willing to distort the truth. And all that McCarthy had to do was strike the public in the right spot for everything to fall apart. That is, he had to tell the right lie. So we could ask, why was it that communism was such a sensitive topic in America in the 1950s? And how was it McCarthy could allege that there were a multitude of, quote, card-carrying communists, unquote, that in the State Department that successfully launched his career? It's categorically false, but especially considering that he was sloppy with his demagoguery. Well, to answer that question, I think we need to discuss the political and social climate at the time and the role of communism in America. And we can begin with some of the history of communism. The first among many communist revolutions observed in the 20th century, which is really the first communist revolution, well, at least the first successful communist revolution. It was the famous Russian Revolution, which really began to fit the traditional idea of a revolution around the year 1917 or 1918. They had a complete restructuring, and the royal family was killed in 1918, and the Soviet Union was established in late 1922, very late 1922, nearly 1923. Now, the coverage of this really worried Americans. Not the least of these worries stemmed from the fact that the heads of the Russian Revolution pretty much unanimously declared that the goal of communism in Russia would not be realized without the success of a world revolution, that is, communism everywhere. So at this time, the U.S. saw what was now labeled as the First Red Scare, which really only materialized as increased hostility to unionization and increased hostility towards Eastern European immigrants. But the U.S. did maintain an apprehensive alliance with the Soviets during the Second World War, but the hostility towards the USSR was always present, and it grew steadily stronger even after World War II ended, as the USSR continued to grow into what appeared to be an unstoppable force. The USSR continued to expand through annexations in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Romania. The Greek Communist Party started a civil war in Greece in 1946, which technically was not endorsed by the Soviet Union, but the U.S. interpreted it as though it were. But Chairman Mao proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. It really appeared as though the communist ideology was engulfing all of Eurasia, and quickly, in a matter of a few years. Then in 1949, a bombshell was dropped. It was the Soviets' first nuclear bombshell, and it was just 4 years after the U.S. had unveiled this new technology, the nuclear arms, to the Soviets, to the world. The Soviets had gone and developed their own, and what really annoyed Americans was that they stole it from us. Despite America's best efforts, Soviet espionage was really effective. All they needed was one guy in the inner circle to export U.S. military secrets. The U.S. had their own espionage network in Russia, but the USSR had taken the prized possession. They'd taken the nuclear bomb. There was a German theoretical physicist, Klaus Fuchs, who was revealed to be a Soviet spy. But before he was revealed to be a Soviet spy, he'd already exported sensitive information straight from Los Alamos, where they developed the first nuclear bomb. And then in 1950, a State Department official, Alger Hiss, was his name, was found to have committed espionage and been a member of a communist underground society. So he was spying from within the State Department um, uh, for the Soviet Union. Um, Alger Hiss was convicted on 2 counts of perjury, lying in court, lying under oath. He was not convicted of espionage, but he likely would have been convicted of espionage had the statute of limitations not expired. This was, of course, very big news for the American people. You know, a high-level government official was a Russian spy, and Soviet espionage it became a widespread fear in the U.S. The House Un-American Activities Commission, HUAC, established in 1938. So, before you could say the Second Red Scare. It was reorganized after the war with the explicit goal of investigating communism. In 1947, President Truman created the Federal Employees Loyalty Program with Executive Order 9835, which investigated over 3 million government employees. Only 300 were deemed security risks. It is important to mention, but those are 300 security risks. So such was the political climate of the United States in 1950, and when McCarthy started his crusades. So we ask, how did the political and social state of the U.S. during the late 40s and 50s allow for McCarthy's ungrounded fear-mongering to produce actual political success? The answer is that the American people were paranoid. There were few instances of real Soviet espionage that posed a genuine threat to global security. They stole our bomb, and the American people heard about every one of them through the media. There was a real Communist Party in the United States, which at its peak had 80,000 National Card Gang members, which is not a lot of members, but ultimately it was an effective campaign platform. It ensured journalistic success, and it was ingrained in the public collective consciousness. McCarthy knew this. So what actually came about through McCarthy's wheeling speech? Well, it's important to remember that McCarthy is making these allegations against a Democratic administration. Harry Truman was a Democrat. His Secretary of State was appointed by a Democratic president. So Truman is forced to respond. And he knows there are no such names known to his Secretary of State, who he appointed, Dean Acheson. But he still has to do something. So he arranges for a Democratic congressional committee, partisan committee, to gather, investigate, and ultimately discredit McCarthy. This committee, which I briefly mentioned earlier, called the Tidings Committee, held hearings from March to July in 1950, and ultimately issued a final report admonishing McCarthy for perpetrating, quote, a fraud and a hoax, unquote, on the American people. The progressives really viewed McCarthy's efforts as a political witch hunt, but he was popular with Republicans. The Tidings Committee didn't really do anything. McCarthy was publicly rebuked, but the Tidings Committee was clearly a partisan entity. It didn't really deter McCarthy at all. And in June 1950, on the floor of Congress, McCarthy charged that the Secretary of Defense and former Secretary of State, General George Marshall, had fallen prey to, quote, a communist conspiracy on a scale so immense as to dwarf any previous such venture in the history of man, unquote. He claimed that Marshall, who was a war hero, had helped, like a real war hero, had helped to diminish the United States in world affairs, enabling the United States to, quote, finally fall victim to Soviet intrigue and Russian military might, unquote. Again, these charges were not taken lightly, despite the way the Tidings Committee ultimately ruled. And they were taken seriously. During Eisenhower's 1952 campaign, Ike, a Republican, refused to publicly denounce McCarthy because it wasn't politically popular amongst Republicans. And he stated that, quote, I will not get into the gutter with that guy, unquote. And this shows, if anything, that McCarthy was actually, well, if not popular, then feared, politically feared, which means that McCarthyism worked. His terrorism worked, at least in the short term. McCarthy was instantly a force to be reckoned with when he came out with these charges. McCarthy campaigned with Eisenhower, who went on to win the presidential election by a very substantial margin. In fact, the Republicans regained the Senate in 1950, and in 1951, the Senate Subcommittee on Privileges and Elections began investigating McCarthy for his actions in the 1950 elections based on allegations that he had been a dirty campaigner. These hearings, which were called the Gillette-Hennings hearings, were a disaster for pretty much everybody involved. No one came out looking good in the end. McCarthy was not subpoenaed to appear before the committee, so he never appeared. When the committee chairman attacked him for it, McCarthy wrote letters to the committee accusing them of protecting communists. So, there's his motif, communism. In the end, several members resigned from the subcommittee in disgust, including the original chairman. So McCarthy was constantly on the offensive after the wheeling speech. That was his modus operandi. And his popularity in the Republican Party had not yet begun to dip. He was reelected in 1952. The people of Wisconsin reelected him as one of their senators. And capitalizing on the new Republican majority, he became the chairman of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, or the SBSI. McCarthy immediately turned his power against the government's overseas broadcast division, the Voice of America, the VOA. And McCarthy's investigation, which was held from February to March 1953, resulted in several resignations or transfers. It was around this time that McCarthy appointed 26-year-old Roy Cohn as chief counsel. He also happens to be my chief counsel to the subcommittee, and future Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy as his assistant counsel. Roy Cohn is an interesting character for a number of reasons. There's no reason for me to tell you too much about him, but he was something of a legal prodigy, really. His father was a prominent judge. He graduated from a good law school at age 19. He was not yet old enough to be admitted to the bar. But when he was admitted to the bar, one of his very first trials as a prosecutor was the infamous Rosenberg trial. Without getting too far into the weeds of the Rosenbergs, I can say that there was a married couple, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were accused of being Soviet spies. And there was some truth to the charges. Julius Rosenberg was legitimately a Soviet spy. But the information he exported to the Soviets was so minor as to be almost completely inconsequential. And Ethel Rosenberg, Julius's wife, had no Soviet connections whatsoever. But Roy Cohn, using his connection with the judge and witnesses, he managed to get a guilty verdict for both Rosenbergs, and both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed by the state in 1953, leaving behind 2 young children, who later went on to speak out against the ruling. So this gives you a sense of Roy Cohn's ruthless determination to win. And this was the guy McCarthy hired as his chief counsel. He was also later hired by several mafiosos, Fat Tony Salerno, a big name, and Donald Trump, young Donald Trump in the 80s. McCarthy saw what Cohn did to the Rosenbergs. He saw what Cohn was, really, and he wanted. On top of all this, the people who were being revealed as communist sympathizers, atomic spies, what have you, they were people with names like Rosenberg, Golodinsky, Greenglass. They were disproportionately Jewish. McCarthy, who had been accused privately of anti-Semitism, he was anti-Semitic, hired Jewish lawyers with the express aim of combating accusations of anti-Semitism. I'm not saying this, to build McCarthy up to be the most despicable character I could possibly describe. But this is his political means that he operated with it. As a second term went on, he became increasingly unrestrained. He was always on the offensive, and in 1953, he directed his attack towards the Army. He was very confident towards the U.S. Army. And you would be right to question his motives. The Army certainly did. McCarthy, through his role as chairman of the SBSI, began investigating the Army and its facility at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. As the investigation moved forward, its focus became an Army dentist. In 1952, the Army drafted a New York dentist, Irving Perez, who had been associated with pro-communist groups prior to joining the military. During his service, Perez was promoted from captain to major. McCarthy began investigating and demanded Perez's testimony before his committee. Perez refused, and McCarthy soon contacted the Secretary of the Army demanding Perez's court-martial. Instead, Perez requested that his pending discharge be granted immediately. It was. When Perez's commanding officer, Brigadier General Ralph Zwicker, testified, McCarthy had questioned and demanded answers. McCarthy asked why Perez was promoted, and he was granted an honorable discharge. General Zwicker was evasive and uncooperative. Okay, which further enraged McCarthy, and he had a confrontational personality. Before Zwicker's testimony ended, McCarthy accused him of being unfit to wear his uniform. And he was a war hero. And these personal attacks aimed at a battlefield hero were not well received by the media, by his constituency. So So why would McCarthy, obviously unpopular position, why would he prosecute such a well-respected entity, the U.S. Army of all things? The Army certainly had their theories, and as a response, the U.S. Army brought charges against McCarthy and Roy Cohn as well for pressuring the Army to give preferential treatment to David Schein, a former McCarthy aide and personal friend of Cohn who had been drafted. So the Army drafted a personal friend and employee of McCarthy, and soon after this happens, McCarthy goes after the Army, and the Army speculates that they believe that they're trying to give this employee, David Schein, preferential treatment. This ultimately led to a role reversal. The SBSI was now responsible for holding hearings to judge the validity of the charges, with a guy named Carl Munt as the chairman, rather than McCarthy. This was the turning point for McCarthy. These hearings, none of the Army McCarthy hearings, were widely televised and received incredible viewership. People got to judge McCarthy for themselves, and they realized who he really was. There's no doubt. There's a very famous moment during these hearings, which a lot of people pinpoint as the point where McCarthy, the point where his downfall began. There's a famous moment in these hearings where McCarthy attempts to discredit the Army by citing an ancillary lawyer's past connection to the Communist Party of the United States of America, the CPUSA. And the Army's lawyer responds,
let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
You should know that this was really the end of McCarthy's career. And these hearings, which were widely televised and received incredible viewership, that was it for McCarthy. The public saw him from this point forward as a bully, which is what he was. And the senators began to turn on McCarthy, which doesn't suggest so much that there was a change in how the senators viewed McCarthy, but more so that they no longer had a reason to fear McCarthy because he became so unpopular overnight. In fact, a Republican senator from Vermont, a Republican, his own party, proposed that McCarthy be stripped of all his committee assignments. And later, the Senate voted a bipartisan vote with a Republican majority, 75-12, to censure McCarthy after the Watkins Committee gathered in 1954 to investigate McCarthy's ethics. So ultimately, McCarthy fell into obscurity. and he was generally ignored in Washington. He lost all respect. He died May 2nd while still in office as a junior senator during his second term. The official cause of death was acute hepatitis, but it was most likely, and this is sort of medical consensus or historical consensus at the very least, that his death to acute hepatitis was most likely brought on by heavy drinking, and his drinking became heavier following his censure. So the fear of the Soviet threat certainly did not die with McCarthy. We're here today, and obviously it couldn't have started with McCarthy because he capitalized on it. And the truth is that if McCarthy had lived 10 years longer, his inflammatory rhetoric may have been even more effective during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was perhaps when anti-Soviet sentiments and fears really reached their heights. But where does that leave us today? And communism is still widely unpopular in the United States, and the Soviet Union fell over 30 years ago. But we certainly can't blame McCarthy for the majority of our lasting anti-communist sentiments, especially given the brutal regimes of Stalin, Mao, the Cambodian genocide under Pol Pot, the regime in North Korea. Now, McCarthyism serves more as a cautionary tale than anything else. McCarthyism demonstrates the effect of fear-mongering as a political tool. And it really all begins with this infamous speech in this quiet, unassuming town of Wheeling, West Virginia, where he was brought to speak in 1950. And alas, outside of the lessons we learned, nothing good can really be said to have come out of McCarthy's terrorism. I mean, there was virtually no success in revealing communists in the government. But if it makes you feeling better, Roy Cohn went on to die of AIDS in 1986.
I do not have AIDS.
Thank you for listening.